Welcome back to Singapore Property Talk Law. We're diving deep into something that's probably top of mind if you're thinking about buying property here in Singapore, buyer stamp duty.
Exactly. It's one of those things that can really catch you off guard if you're not prepared, especially with the recent changes. I'm Serene, by the way, and I'm here to help you understand how BSD might impact your situation.
I'm Damien, and I'm definitely guilty of not fully understanding BSD myself, so I'm looking forward to this deep dive. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is buyer stamp duty? It's a tax, sure, but what makes it different from other property taxes?
Well, BSD is basically the tax you pay on documents when you buy or acquire property here in Singapore. It's like the official stamp of approval, quite literally. And it's not just for straightforward purchases either. It applies if you inherit property or receive it as a gift or even acquire it through a company liquidation.
Wow, so even if you're not directly buying a property, you could still be on the hook for BSD. That's good to know. I imagine this affects a lot of different situations.
It really does. Now, here's something to keep in mind. BSD is calculated based on either the purchase price or the market value of the property, whichever is higher.
So no getting a friend discount to lower your tax bill, huh?
hmm
The government's got their eyes on the true value, but how is it actually calculated? Is it just a flat fee, or does it depend on the price?
BSD in Singapore is calculated on a tiered system. It starts at 1% for the first $180,000 of the property value, and then the rate increases as the value goes up. And this is where those recent changes come in. In February 2023, the top rate was bumped up to 6% for residential properties.
Okay, 6% on the higher end. That sounds like it can add up pretty quickly, especially for those multi-million-dollar condos.
You're absolutely right. For every additional $1 million in property value above $3.64 million, you'll be paying $60,000 in BSD. That's definitely something to consider when budgeting.
Definitely. I remember when foreigners buying residential property in Singapore were hit with that massive 60% ABSD rate on top of the regular BSD.
That's right, the additional buyer's stamp duty, or ABSD. It's an extra tax specifically for foreign buyers and those purchasing multiple properties. That move certainly made headlines.
It definitely sent a strong message about the government's efforts to cool the market. It makes you realize how important it is to understand BSD, but sometimes those percentages can feel a bit abstract. Can we walk through a few real-life examples to see how these rates actually play out?
Absolutely. Let's say you're looking at a condo priced at $1 million.
A classic Singaporean dream for many.
For that $1 million condo, you'd pay 1% on the first $180,000, which comes out to $1,800. Then for the next $180,000, it's 2%, so another $3,600. And for the remaining $640,000, you're looking at 3% or $17,200.
So all in all, that's a BSD of $24,600 on a $1 million condo. That's a significant chunk of change to add on top of the purchase price.
It certainly is. And now imagine someone going for a luxurious $5 million penthouse.
Talk about living the high life. I can already picture the amazing view.
Well, that view comes with a hefty BSD bill. Remember that top tier rate of 6% for amounts above $3.64 million? In this case, that 6% applies to a whopping $2 million of the property value. The total BSD for that $5 million penthouse ends up being $299,600.
Wow, that's a serious number. It really highlights how important it is to factor BSD into your budget early on. But we've been talking a lot about condos. What about those who are interested in non-residential properties?
Good point. BSD applies to those as well, although the rates are slightly lower than the residential rates. We're talking about things like offices, shops, and industrial spaces.
Right. But then there are those properties that combine residential and non-residential spaces, the mixed-use developments. How does BSD work for those?
That's where it gets a bit more nuanced. Mixed-use properties are taxed based on their designated use. So the portion used for residential purposes is taxed at the residential rate, and the portion used for non-residential purposes is taxed at the non-residential rate.
I see. So if someone buys an HDB shop with living quarters above it, the living space would be subject to the residential BSD rates, while the shop space would fall under the non-residential rates. Makes sense.
Exactly. And if you're ever unsure about the designated use of a property, you can actually check with the Urban Redevelopment Authority, or URA. They have an online service called Inquiry on Approved Use of Premises that can provide that information.
So there's no guessing game or relying on the seller's word. The URA has the official record. But let's say someone has looked at all the numbers and they're facing a big BSD bill. Are there any ways to potentially reduce that amount? Any remissions or exemptions they could look into?
Well, there are a few situations where you might qualify for a BSD remission. One example is if you're buying land that's zoned for residential use, but your plan is to develop it for solely non-residential purposes.
Interesting. So say you buy a plot of land zoned for condos, but you want to build a shopping mall instead.
Exactly. You could potentially apply for a remission and pay the lower non-residential BSD rates instead.
That's good to know. So it's not a guaranteed free pass, but it's definitely worth exploring if you're in that kind of situation. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the basics of what BSD is to how it's calculated and even some potential remissions. It's clearly a multifaceted topic.
It definitely is multifaceted, and those rules haven't stayed static. They've evolved over time, which is why understanding the history and purpose of BSD can give you a better grasp of the bigger picture.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's take a quick trip down memory lane. When was BSD first introduced in Singapore?
BSD was actually first introduced way back in 1941, but it has gone through significant changes over the years, particularly in response to market fluctuations and the government's efforts to stabilize the property sector.
It sounds like a bit of a roller coaster ride for BSD. What were some of the major milestones in its evolution?
Well, if we fast forward to the early 2000s, we see a period of rapid growth in the property market. To address concerns about overheating, the government started introducing cooling measures.
Cooling measures. Were those specifically targeting BSD, or were there other strategies in play?
It wasn't just about BSD at that point. They implemented measures like removing the interest absorption scheme and the interest-only scheme, which basically made it easier for buyers to enter the market by deferring payments. Removing these schemes was a way to encourage more responsible lending and borrowing.
So they were trying to curb excessive speculation
Yeah.
and prevent people from overstretching themselves financially. It sounds like a proactive approach to ensuring a more sustainable market.
Exactly. And then in 2010, they introduced the seller's stamp duty, or SSD. This was a game changer.
Okay, so SSD is a tax on sellers, as opposed to BSD, which is on buyers. What was the rationale behind introducing SSD?
The idea was to discourage people from flipping properties for a quick profit. SSD is a tax you have to pay if you sell your property within a certain holding period. It initially applied to properties sold within 1 year, but was later extended to 3 years.
So if you buy a property and sell it within 3 years, you could be hit with SSD. That definitely puts a damper on short-term speculation.
It does. And then to further cool the market, they introduced the additional buyer's stamp duty, or ABSD, in 2011.
Right, we talked about ABSD earlier. That's the extra tax for foreigners and people buying their second, third, or subsequent properties.
Exactly. And ABSD rates, particularly for foreigners, have seen some significant increases over the years.
I remember back in 2023 when the ABSD for foreigners buying residential property jumped to a whopping 60%. It really solidified the government's commitment to prioritizing homeownership for Singaporeans.
It certainly did. All these measures, from the tweaks to BSD to the introduction of SSD and ABSD, show how the government actively manages the property market. And it underscores the need for buyers and sellers to stay informed and adapt to these changing dynamics.
It's clear that BSD plays a pivotal role in shaping the Singapore property landscape. But I'd love to shift gears for a moment and focus on a scenario that often comes up. Couples buying a property together. What happens with BSD if down the line they decide to go their separate ways?
That's a very relevant scenario, especially in the context of divorce proceedings. It's important to remember that even if a couple is going through a separation and one spouse wants to buy out the other's share of the property, BSD still applies.
Wait, really? Even though they're married? And it's essentially a transfer between spouses.
Yes, that's right. BSD applies to all property transactions, regardless of the relationship between the buyer and seller. So even if you're buying your spouse's share of a property you already co-own, you'll need to pay BSD based on either the purchase price or the market value, whichever is higher.
That's an important detail for couples to be aware of, especially during a time that's already emotionally and financially challenging. And to make things more complex, if the transfer happens within that SSD holding period, the selling spouse might also have to pay SSD.
You're absolutely right. It can get quite complicated.
Are there any ways to potentially avoid these taxes in a divorce situation?
Well, thankfully, there's a possibility of getting a remission for both BSD and SSD if the transfer is happening as part of matrimonial proceedings. But there are specific conditions that need to be met, which are outlined by the IRS. It's always best to consult with a professional to understand your options fully.
Good advice. It sounds like knowing the ins and outs of these rules can make a big difference in navigating those tricky situations. Speaking of unique scenarios, what happens with BSD in the case of en bloc sales or block purchases, where multiple properties are being sold together?
When you have a situation where multiple properties are being purchased collectively, it's essentially treated as buying one large property for BSD purposes. So the BSD is calculated on the total purchase price of all the properties combined.
So it doesn't matter if there's a single contract for all the properties
Yeah.
or separate documents for each unit. The BSD is based on the total value. That makes sense. But what if there are separate documents for each property? Do you have to pay BSD on every single one?
That's a great question. In cases where there are separate documents, only one of those documents needs to be stamped with the full BSD based on the combined purchase price. It streamlines the process and avoids unnecessary paperwork.
That's good to know. It seems like BSD really touches upon many different aspects of the Singapore property market. We've covered a lot of ground. From the historical evolution of BSD to those specific scenarios like divorce settlements and unblocked sales, it's clear that BSD isn't just a one-size-fits-all tax. It adapts to different situations and plays a key role in shaping the property landscape here.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, staying informed about the nuances of BSD is crucial for anyone involved in the Singapore property market.
For sure. But before we wrap up our deep dive, there's one more important aspect of BSD we need to address: the timing of payment. Right, we've talked about what BSD is, how it's calculated, and even some specific scenarios where it comes into play. But when exactly do you have to pay this tax? Is it right when you sign the purchase agreement?
Well, technically, you're supposed to stamp the document, which means paying the BSD before you sign it.
So no signing on the dotted line until the taxman is happy.
That's the ideal scenario. But there is a grace period. You have 14 days after signing the document, if it's signed in Singapore.
Okay, so a little bit of breathing room for those last-minute arrangements. What if the document is signed overseas?
If the document is signed overseas, you have 30 days after receiving it in Singapore to get that BSD paid.
So even if you're closing a deal on a beachfront villa in Bali, you've got to keep that BSD deadline in mind when you're back in Singapore. But it sounds like these deadlines are pretty important. What happens if you miss them?
Missing those deadlines can lead to penalties and fines, which can add up quickly. It's definitely best to aim for getting your BSD sorted out as soon as possible.
Avoid those extra costs and headaches. Well, Serene, I feel like we've really demystified BSD today. We've covered so much ground, from the historical context to the nitty-gritty calculations and even those special scenarios. What are your final thoughts for our listeners who are navigating the Singapore property market?
I think the key takeaway is that knowledge is power. Understanding BSD, knowing how it impacts your specific situation, and staying informed about any changes or updates are crucial steps towards making smart decisions. Don't be afraid to ask questions, seek professional advice, and do your research.
That's great advice. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of property hunting. But taking the time to understand the financial implications, including BSD, can save you a lot of stress down the road.
Exactly. Remember, buying a property in Singapore is a significant investment, and BSD is just one piece of that puzzle. Being prepared and informed is the best way to ensure a smooth and successful experience.
Well said, Serene. And on that note, we've reached the end of our BSD deep dive. A huge thank you to Serene for sharing her expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on Singapore Property Talk Law. We hope you found this episode informative and helpful. Until next time, happy property hunting.